The sword flashed. The crowd roared like a storm wind taking a roof, and the girl with the tangled hair did not cry out. She bit her tongue so hard she tasted iron and ash, and the taste was like the whole of King's Landing poured into her mouth at once. Smoke from the torches, sweat from 1,000 bodies pressed together, wine gone sour on a beggar's breath, the river's stink beyond the walls. She stared at the high stone and iron, the boy king's pale, satisfied face, the sep's white steps, and the headsman's stroke that made the world tilt. Somewhere close by, a man shouted her father's name. She could not see Sansa. She could not see anything except the blade descending and a mother pushing past her and the hand that had once ruffled her hair falling away forever in her mind. No one caught her wrist. No rough hand hauled her off her feet. The crowd surged and she was a leaf on black water, carried, shoved, spun, and in that crush a gold cloak's mailed arm drove at her face. She ducked, slid under, felt the press of his boot on her back, the world narrowing until the earth itself was only elbows, knees, cries, the glitter of spear points like stars fallen into mortar. She clawed for breath and found a handhold on the base of a statue no god would claim now. The cloak's boot lifted. She ran. She ran with her head down and her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would draw crossbows. She ran along the foot of the hill, away from the sep's bell that would sing no dirge for her father. Alley to alley, through a tannery yard where hides dripped like flayed men and dogs barked with foam on their jaws, through a courtyard with cracked tiles and a tree clawing at emptiness, through a kitchen door propped with a barrel. The barrel stank of slops. The door gave her a sliver of dark. She slid through and crouched among sacks of flour split open like bellies in a butcher's shop. Her breath came back in slivers. It scraped her throat like sand. The kitchen was dark except for a candle guttering beside a stack of wooden bowls and a man asleep across two stools with his mouth open and both hands clasped around a flagon. A mouse darted out and looked at her as if judging. She looked back. "Go away," she whispered. But the mouse was braver than most men that night and crept to the split sack to feast. The girl's hands, dirty, nicked with the memory of a training master's gentle taps across the knuckles, felt down into her belt, and she teased loose the leather wrapping around a thing that had weight enough to steady her. Needle came out of its wraps with a faint whisper of steel on cloth. She touched the blade's point with her fingertip and the bite of it brought her into herself again. There was an order to things. Left foot first, eyes, breath, point. There were names to say when you had nothing else to say, and she said them in silence so the sleeping man would not hear. The boy with the crown, his mother with iron for eyes, the king's guard with their golden leaves hiding rot, the lord with the spider badge, the headsman's shadow. The names steadied her like her sword did. If she spoke them enough, the world might hold still. When she could stand, she slid sideways to the door again. Voices had begun to trickle down the alley, the ugly voices men use when they think no one will remember their words. She was small. She was quick. When she reached the street again, the crowd had thinned to clumps like seaweed left by tide. She threaded between them, her face down, her hair matted into a boy's tangle with grease and dust. A drunk jostled her, inhaled to curse, then saw the sword hilt at her belt and thought better of it. Needle's blade was not long, but on her hip it made a promise. She crossed under a laundry line heavy with wet linen and ducked into a lane where the cobbles turned to packed, cracked clay. This was the edge of Flea Bottom, where the city seemed to sag toward the river and the river seemed to laugh at it. The alleys made mazes around cookshops and bucket privies. The houses leaned together as if gossiping. A woman was weeping. A thin cat howled in the way of cats when they're hunting or courting or dying, which all sounded alike here. "You're lost," a voice said. Arya spun like Syrio had taught. "Point low, wait forward." The boy who had spoken had a face like a lump of bread and weasel-bright eyes. He hopped back, hands up, grinning, then not grinning when he saw that she would absolutely put Needle through him if he stepped closer. "You're a little rat with a tooth," he amended and stayed where he was. "Lose that and the gutters will drink you. Keep it and the gold cloaks will. Tyreek's boys are cutting any throat in the wrong place tonight." She thought of her father's head falling and her stomach became a fist. "Leave me," she said. "Go away or I'll stick you." His eyes glittered. Stick me and you'll be sticky with me. He jerked his chin toward the next bend in the lane. Not a night to be alone, rat. She kissed her teeth the way she'd heard the fishwives do and took 2 careful steps past him without turning her back. He didn't grab her. He trailed instead, whistling softly under his breath, until the alley gave onto a more open, dirt-swept space where a man had set up a bench and a brazier and was hammering nails into horseshoes in a rhythm of patience. The boy hopped away at this point, pried a crumb from his pocket, and flicked it to the brazier, where it caught and flashed and was gone. "Come on, rat," he said, and she went because if he led her to a trap she would cut him and anyone else who grabbed for her, and if he led her to a hole to hide in she wanted it. He led her to a door that had once been painted blue and now showed only heartwood and thumbprints. He tapped a pattern with his knuckles that meant nothing to her and everything to whoever was listening. And when the door opened, the person behind it was a narrow girl with hair cut blunt as straw. The narrow girl stared at Arya's sword hilt and then at Arya's face. "Not tonight," she said. She tried to close the door. "Her," the weasel-eyed boy said. "The one from the hill. The wolf one." The door stopped. The narrow girl's eyes flickered, and in that flicker Arya saw calculation as clean and practiced as a sword stroke. The door opened wider. "You come with your teeth in their sheaths," the narrow girl said. "You talk only if spoken to. If anyone asks, you're mouse. If no one asks, you're smoke." "I'm not mouse," Arya said. She didn't put needle away. "Tonight you are, if you want to live." The narrow girl tipped her head and the weasel-eyed boy vanished like he'd never been. The room beyond smelled of boiled bones and tallow, and in the corner a cot had a thin blanket and a shadow that could have been a sleeping child or a bundle of rags. The girl shut the door and slid a bar across it out of habit rather than fear. She moved with the careful readiness of someone who knows that if a thing goes wrong, it is going to go very wrong indeed. The narrow girl led her through 2 rooms and down a set of steps so steep they might as well have been a ladder. At the bottom, someone had set candles in niches. The light trembled against damp walls. "You stay here," the narrow girl said. "If the bells ring, you listen for footsteps. There are doors through doors here. You don't open any unless I tell you. You cry, the whole city will hear. You don't, the city will forget you came." She went. Arya looked at the candles and at the holes gnawed by rats in the plaster and said the names again under her breath. The boy king, his mother, the knight with his face like a pretty girl's, the greasy lord who had smiled at her father and sold him. She pressed Needle's hilt into her palm and felt it fit. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep either. The night passed with the slow groan of an old ship putting out into black water. Feet came near and went away again. Once, mid-bell, a clatter ran along the street above like dice laid down by gods with clumsy hands. When light found the edges of the room at last, she counted her breathing until the narrow girl returned. "You kept," the girl said. Approval didn't reach her voice, but it moved in the angle of her mouth. "Are you hungry, mouse?" Arya nodded. The girl brought broth that tasted of everything that had been boiled in it for a week, the salt and the fat and the mystery of it a good weight in her belly. She ate while her mind pushed against itself like a trapped bird. She could not sit here like a sack of meal waiting for a hand. "Take me to the Red Keep," she said. "I need to find my sister." The narrow girl blinked slowly. "I don't know you," she said. "I should tell you to run the other way until the sea puts a stop to you. But there are men here who listen for whispers no one even thought they were speaking. Maybe one of them knows someone who owes a debt. Keep your sword hidden. Keep your mouth a hole the wind blows past." 2 hours later, a man climbed down into the candle place. He wore a plain jerkin, and when he reached the bottom he smiled as if he were happy to be any place at all. His eyes were small, soft, unreadable. Arya recognized him from corridors and councils where she had sulked and watched while her father moved pieces on a board and was told, politely, that the rules had been changed after he sat down to play. "My little friends are generous tonight," he said, and you could have believed he meant the narrow girl and the weasel-eyed boy and whatever ghost slept under the blanket in the corner. "They bring me news and sometimes they bring me guests. I am a friend to guests." "I don't need friends," Arya said. "Forgive me." The man bowed his head, smiling. "I misspoke. I am a friend to the realm." He set a bundle on the table and untied it. There was a cap in there that would crush her hair down and make her shape strange. There was a tunic mended until it was more a map of stitches than cloth. There was a little pot of something that would darken skin to the city's color and make a lord's daughter look like a fishmonger's boy. There was bread, too, crusty and old and better than the broth. "You will want this," he said softly, as if the clothes were medicine he knew she'd refuse unless he called them sweet. "You will want to live. You have the look of one who intends to do more than that." She took the cap because it could be thrown away later. She took the tunic because hers had blood on it she couldn't be sure was all other people's. "My sister," she said. "I have to see her. They'll hurt her because of me. They will hurt her because they think they may." He put his hands together like a priest, but he was no priest that had ever served at a true altar. "Your sister will be safer if the queen believes you drowned in a gutter with the rest. Your father did not trust me. He was wise. He had ever the northern habit of being better than those around him. It is a habit that does not always leave a man standing. Yet I tried, little one. I tried. I would try again if it would help now." Arya looked at him and saw that he was what he was. A man who knew secrets and hid them behind softness, who used people and kissed their cheeks after. She should have thrust needle up under his ribs then and there. She did not. "If I can't see her, I have to be close. I have to hear what they do to her." He nodded, as if she were making a promise to him instead of to herself. "The kitchens," he said. "The tunnels. A mouse scurrying where the cats do not look. Say nothing. Look at no one. Remember that the walls in this city have ears, and sometimes the ears have knives." He moved like water where rocks tried to make the stream break. He made a door appear under a stair. He led her up through hum and clatter into a world she knew only from the wrong side of it. The red keep beating like a heart you never hear until you put your ear to the bone. Here it was, the wormwood taste of it in her mouth. Smoke from ovens. Gossips in tight knots over barreled flour. A spit turning brown meat while a boy with a wooden hand steadied it. No one looked at her because in such places children were as invisible as spoons. By afternoon, after she had run 3 messages from a stern cook to a slovenly steward and scrubbed a pot that had been used to ruin 5 different things in the course of a week, the man with the small eyes drifted past her again as if by accident, not looking at her even as his voice brushed her ear. "Mager's holdfast before dusk. If your feet know how to be quiet, you will be granted a kindness." She kept her feet quiet. When the shadows lengthened and the queen passed through the hall with her captive lamb beside her and 3 men with white cloaks showing their clean virtue in cloth and paint, Arya let a tray give her cover and slipped down a hall where the torches licked at the stone as if they tasted it. The door to the holdfast was sealed, then unsealed, then sealed again. Inside, women with oil lamps moved slowly like stars crossing a winter sky. No one noticed a little scullion with a rag over her head. The gods had seen to that. Or perhaps the man had. In a chamber near the queen's, she found Sansa. She did not run to her. She stood and drank the sight of her the way she had gulped the broth. A girl who had once been all songs and ribbons, whose ribbons now chafed and whose songs had gone thin and sad. Sansa stood very straight and held her hands at her waist like a lady in a picture. Her eye was bruised, yellow turning to green like a rotten apple's flesh. She said something in a voice too calm for someone so young. The older woman beside her smoothed her hair and called her sweetling and told her she was brave. Arya held on to the doorway with her fingertips and learned how to stand very still. Later, in a narrower passage, Sansa came alone with her head bowed, and Arya slipped behind a pillar and then out into her path. Sansa's mouth opened and then shut again. The candlelight trembled around them like a living thing trying to hear. "Arya?" Sansa breathed, not moving her lips much. "No. You can't." "I won't be seen," Arya said. Her voice had broken into 1,000 small pieces and pasted itself back together into something low and fierce. "I won't be caught. I just had to see." Sansa did a thing with her face that tried to be both smiling and not crying. "Run," she said, voice very small now. "Please. It's a trap here. All of it. I know." Arya wanted to put her cheek to Sansa's shoulder, a thing she had never wanted when the world was still itself. I can hear things in the walls. I can find things. I'll come again. You can't. Sansa shook her head very slightly. There were footsteps in the next room. You won't. You, be careful. The older woman returned. Arya became a shadow again. She carried her shadow back to the kitchens and then to the place under the stairs and deeper, to where water licked at stone and the air was wet with secrets. There the man was waiting, and the look he gave her when she came into his candlelight told her that he had arranged this for reasons that would never be her reasons. You want me grateful, little mouse, she thought, and because it pleased her to spoil his plans in small ways, she did not say thank you. Days grew into a rhythm cut by knives. She rose when the bakers did. She stole moments to walk lanes that the rest of the world had forgotten when the keep was young, shafts and culverts and passages so low she had to crawl, so narrow even her thin shoulders rubbed. She brought news to the man, sometimes without meaning to. The red wine the queen preferred, the way the youngest prince cried like a kitten when he couldn't find his mother, which of the white cloaks had a limp after a training fall. She watched Sansa from distances that ached in her bones. She watched the boy king from distances that did not ache at all because her body knew what her heart already did. That one day the distance would close and someone would take what he had taken. The city changed with the season. Soldiers in half their armor sat on stoops and diced. The hands of two men who'd lost to the same gambler lay in a gutter. The butcher's boy in the market with the black hair who'd once winked at her had no wink anymore. He had the weathered look of a person who understood that the city could fill its belly forever and never be full. On one morning when the sun burned tight and white behind the sea's haze, riders in red passed down the street, and not long after there were screams and hammered doors and the sound of small things breaking. Later Arya saw a girl sitting on a threshold with her hands limp in her lap and soot on her face. The girl had a bruise blooming like a storm cloud, and beside her a cradle was empty. Arya said the king's name, the queen's, the names of the men in red and gold. She went that night to the man and asked him if he could stop it. I can do what I can do, he said quietly, and I can make use of what I cannot. This isn't a riddle, she said. Babies. His look went terribly old. My dear child, he said, and his voice was so gentle she wanted to crack it like a shell. Everything in this city is a riddle that ends with a knife. Gendry remained in the city a while longer, hammering at Tobo Mott's forge until the day two gold cloaks looked too long at his jawline and their eyes lit with the hateful light of certainty. After that, he was gone. He did not come to say farewell to the ragged boy who had once asked him for a nail to make a hook and not used it to catch any fish. He vanished as completely as if the river had eaten him. On a night when the heat lay like a hand on the city, Arya crept to the forge with a piece of stale bread and left it on the step in a silly, stubborn offering to emptiness. In the morning, someone else had taken it. When the small man came with his sellsword and his sharp eyes and a grin that had teeth in it, the Red Keep breathed out. Janos Slint was sent somewhere cold enough to teach him a new color of fear. The queen spat words and had to swallow them again. Arya watched the small man watch the city. He looked at men like coins and at children like budgets and at secrets like fine wine that must be handled carefully. She took to listening outside his door and learned the shape of his footfalls and what drink made him talk with his hands. She learned that beneath the soft politeness of that other man's words there was a band of iron, and beneath the new hand's jokes a quicksilver caution. She tried the name Tyrion on her tongue and liked the way it fit with curse or praise. Riot came like weather. One moment there was a parade and a prince preening and girls tossing flowers because no one had bread to throw. Then a hand reached. Then a stone flew. Then the air was hot with the breath of too many bodies pressed into the same wrong place. Sansa's litter lurched. The world leaned. Arya felt a pressure like a giant's thumb against the crown of her head, and then the crowd broke and reformed with new shapes. She saw the queen's mouth move like a fish in a bucket. She saw men with dogs' faces shouting. She saw the hound gathering Sansa the way he'd gather a fallen comrade, roaring, cutting, carving a path in muscle and anger. Arya darted between legs and bit a hand that closed on her collar, spat blood, flung a pot of greasy stew into the faces of two men climbing the side of the litter. Their boots lost purchase. Their bodies made meat noises when they hit the cobbles. When she got clear, her breath burned and her arms shook and her clothes were slick with something that might have been her sweat. She did not look back. She peeled herself along the wall of a wine shop and then sank down in a cold wedge of shade until the city remembered itself enough to keep breathing. He found her there, Sandor Clegane, filthy and enormous, the gash on his cheek old and ugly and the new sweat making a map of his face. He leaned his big shoulder against the wall between the shade line and the sun, slid down to sit like a child who'd never learned how to sit gently, and drank from a skin as if he'd been promised something at the bottom of it. "You," he said without turning his head. His voice had splinters in it. The rat with a nameless face. She held Needle across her knees and kept her chin up. "And you're the dog who bites even when he's fed." He barked a laugh that turned to a cough. "Careful with that tongue. It'll cut you if you're not the one wielding it." His eyes moved at last, slow, measuring. "I've seen you in the kitchens. Don't worry, I don't make sport of rats. Men do that. Boys, guess I'm neither now." "I saw you save my sister," she said. The words came out flat and small and truer than prayer. He looked away. "Saved her from the city, not from her life." He drank again, wiped his mouth with the back of one big hand, and looked at the river beyond the roofs. "Fire's coming," he said, so softly she would have missed it if she weren't a creature made now for small sounds. "I've smelled it in my dreams." When the ships came like black commas on the page of the bay, the smell the hound had spoken of wrapped the city like a cloak you couldn't shrug free of. The hand and the queen and the spider and the men in white and half a dozen of the bolder lords ran the city like a sleeve through a tight cuff. Gates shut. Chains rattled. The bells began to ring. Sansa went to the holdfast with the queen. Arya went to the tunnels with the mice. Night met fire on the Blackwater. It wasn't like any fire Arya had known. It wasn't like hearth or torch or candle. It swallowed light and then burned too bright to look at. It flared with a color no true thing should hold, a green that made the inside of her eyes ache. Ships burned. Men screamed. The river became a dragon's throat. On the parapets, archers loosed until their fingers bled. The little man moved like a cat on a kitchen bench, sure-footed and quick, shouting orders that sounded like jokes and glinted like steel. When the hound saw the fire, he went still as a tree in winter, and then he was gone, walking with a peculiar carefulness that made Arya's heart see the child he had been and the fire that had eaten him. In the tunnels, the air turned to soup. The mice ran messages. Arya ran with them, scudding along damp stones, up narrow steps into a passage that opened near the Godswood. She had breath left when a man in an unfamiliar tabard seized her. He was not Lannister or Tyrell or any of the colors that owned the city yet. He was something else, something from the ships that had tried to climb the walls and had been cast back by Green Hill. He spoke in a river tongue, and she didn't understand the words, but she knew what his hands meant well enough. She jerked her weight. Syrio had taught her that your body was a tool that only needed to remember what the mind had learned. She used her knee, her elbow, the point of her small skull, every hard thing she owned. He cursed and forced her hand against the stone. Needle skittered away once, twice, and came to rest near a crack where water sang softly to itself. He slammed her into the wall and her teeth clicked together and she tasted old coin and blood. He reached for her throat. She reached for Needle. Afterward, the world was very narrow and quiet. She squatted in the passage and breathed through the feeling in her arms, which was like weeping had taken up residence in her elbows. The man's body made a shape shod in unfamiliar boots, and the wet around him was already turning dark and sticky. She wiped Needle on his sleeve and thought of the list she carried like a prayer. This one hadn't been on it. She put him there anyway, as if retroactively saying the name might balance some scale no one else would add. Mit existet, she went on. Toward dawn, the bells rang a new song. Hoofs hammered.
Somewhere trompessant.
The city pivoted on one foot and came down with someone else's weight behind it. In the holdfast, women woke as if waking were a thing you could choose to do. Sansa stood beside the queen and thought, perhaps, that she might live to breathe one more day. Arya crawled up from the tunnels and hugged a wall while men in bright new colors rode in unfamiliar formation, and the hand breathed out. At last. the long, tight breath he'd been holding all night. She saw Tywin Lannister on a mountain of horse and wealth and certainty. She saw the roses of the Reach unfurl at last at the capital's throat. She slid back down into shadow like a shrimp into sand. After the battle, the city did what cities do. Pretended nothing had happened while it cleaned blood off stone. Counted bodies the way misers count coins. It woke from nightmare and went about its business, shuddering sometimes when a door slammed. Arya did not shudder. She lay beneath the keep and listened to water moving through stone and thought of a list that no longer belonged only to a child. She slept, and when she woke she ate, and when she had eaten she put her small hands through the business of the day. This pot carried, this message moved, this corridor explored. A single line connected everything now. Her father's head rolling away in the crowd's roar. The queen's mouth a thin, cruel line. Sansa's fingers fidgeting inside perfect folds of silk. The hound's voice saying fire. The green blaze reflected in the river-soaked eyes of drowning men. The spider came to her and told her the time had come to reconsider. A ship to the east, he said, and it was almost a kindness, almost the way he said it. A quiet birth for a small, quiet creature. There are places where you could become the shape of your anger instead of the fuel for someone else's. She looked at him and saw his long fingers and soft breath and the way he missed nothing. Ever. My sister is here, she said. And the ones I mean to kill are here. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat and opened them again. There are other ways to kill than with your own hand, he said. There are other roads to end a war. I don't want a road, Arya said. I want a door. I want to open it and be inside a room where all the ones who need killing are standing. I want to close the door behind me. I want to do what needs doing, and then I want to open another door. And in the end, I want to open a door and find the sky. He looked tired then, like a man who has carried himself farther than his feet can manage. The world is a hall of doors, he murmured. Be careful what rooms you choose. She didn't take his ship. He took another, and his farewell had more truth in it than most people ever gave her. You will live, he said. That is what frightens me. The city breathed a different air with him gone. His little birds were still in the rafters, but there was a new man feeding them candied plums and waiting for them to whisper back sweet secrets. This man had the bland eyes of a clerk and the careful hands of a butcher, and when Arya saw him the first time he smiled like he used to remember what it was to have his title sewn to his sleeve and then had it ripped off with one hard pull. The queen liked him. That was enough to teach her caution. Joffrey's wedding came with roses and gold sugar and tablecloths the color of old bones. Arya wore a servant's livery and carried a tray with goblets that felt heavier than they were. She passed between men in peacock brocade and women with powdered throats, and she watched the boy who had been her king's mouth twist with spite as if it were wine he was savoring. Sansa's smile floated like a petal on water. Marjorie's was brighter and far more real. The queen said something to her cousin and laughed into her goblet, not watching her son the way a mother should but the way a queen must. Arya had, for a week, carried a small pouch with a powder in it so fine it felt like the ashes of a dream between her fingers. The powder slept under a stone in a culvert now. She had tried to see herself doing it, putting the grief that had grown inside her into a pinch of a stranger's craft and tipping it like salt into a cup, and she had felt something curl in her, refusing. She could put steel into a heart with her own hand. She could not do that other thing. Not yet. She did not need to. Joffrey choked. He pointed at his throat, and his mother tore her face open with a scream that let the room hear the woman under the queen. The hall went up like a beehive struck with a stick. The little man stood very still amid all that motion. The roses trembled. Sansa vanished under a tide of bodies, and Arya, who had learned to move when everyone else was frozen and to hold still when everyone else lunged, flowed toward the door, storing everything she saw. The exact shade of the boy king's lips, the look on the queen's face when shock gave way to a kind of triumph in being the most grieving person present, the way the man with the butcher's hands didn't look surprised enough. She made the door, and the door made a river, and the river took Sansa. Arya reached like a child reaching for a lark and caught only air. She chased, and the city threw alleys at her like dice, and she turned down the wrong one, and then the right one, and then a dead one that taught her a lesson she already knew. There are doors you cannot open, and if you push too long and hard at them, they fall inward onto empty spaces that will swallow you. She didn't see Sansa again. She saw other things. She saw a trial where all the truth in the room was punished for not being lies. She saw a prince from the sunlit south smile like a blade and move like one, two, and she saw him die for his story as much as for his pride. She saw the little man vanish like a coin gone up a sleeve, and she felt the whack. Of the spider departing again and wondered what deserts swallowed all the ships clever men took out of the city. With the queen's father dead and his bones not yet dust in the crypts, the city she had come to know learned a new rhythm that had in it the harsh scrape of the faith's old armor. Men with 7-pointed stars where their loyalties should be sharpened smiles and stuck spears at wrong throats. Marjorie went to a cell with walls that had learned how to listen. Tommen looked always like a child who wants to be told that this game will not hurt. The queen snared herself in nets of her own making and then pretended she had meant to wear them. The man with the careful hands began to move his birds in from the rafters, and they chirped blood and sweetmeats and the things they had seen in the dark. And every now and then one of them came back with a song that spoke of a girl in a tunnel with a sword thin as a lie. There were nights when Arya lay in the black and let the damp creep into her bones and thought of a calm house in Winterfell that might not exist anymore. She thought of a brother with a sword and a sister with a wolf and a mother with grief enough to drown an army. And she thought that if she had let the spider take her when he offered, she might be something else now. More or less, she could not say. She did not regret. She could not. Regret was a warm bed, and she had given hers up for a nest of thorns she had made herself. She took responsibility where she could. Then, she fed a girl who haunted the kitchens and never smiled. She slashed the strap of a man's saddle before he left to raid a poor quarter, and the fall broke enough of him to keep the quarter safe for a month. She stalked a gold cloak into an alley and made the steel in his hand clatter in surprise before she put her own steel where it needed to go. She avoided killing when a blow to the back of the head would change a night enough. She killed when killing was the truest thing. There were names that would not shake loose, and one day one of those names, Meryn Trant, turned down the wrong street. He was older than he'd been the day he'd raised his pretty shield and pretended worth. He wore the gold and white and the air of a man who had proved himself to men like himself so often he believed their proofs. He went to places where the smell made Arya's hands shake for reasons she could not put into words, and she watched him go in and watched him come out and then followed him down a side street where the light had learned not to go. "I know you," he said when the whisper of her feet caught him. His hand went to the hilt he was proud of. "Boy," he added, "because you could make a boy into something you did not need to fear." "You don't," Arya said, and that was the truest thing in the world. He did not know the story of a girl who had learned to make herself the wrong size for the eyes that would find her. He did not know the smell of the sept steps or the sound of a sword on a neck when you loved the man whose neck it was. He did not know the taste of rat's breath in a tunnel when your list was the only warm thing left to you. He drew, annoyed, bored, to teach a child a lesson about disrespect and to make himself feel he still had purpose. She slid inside the swing of his blade and made him cut air. He was clumsy now, fat with certainty. She was small and exact. He bared his teeth in the way of men who tell you they mean to be vicious and are always surprised to find someone else can be more so. He struck hard. She let the blow go past. She saw the line down his side where the plates were weakest. She was her training and her grief and the space beneath the red keep where fools never looked. Needle went in as if it had been waiting for the moment all the days he'd lived. He made a sound like a bellows running out of wind. He tried to say something and found he only had air. His eyes searched for the world he believed he lived in until the last moment, when they had to admit the world had never been what he thought, and also that it never would be, and by then Arya had already stepped back into the shadow that had raised her. After that night, the city hunted ghosts. The man with the careful hands sent his birds farther, sharper, sweeter. The queen regarded her own shrinking realm and set candles to burn until the wax puddled on the floors of her chambers. Tommen looked out at the smoke and didn't understand why breathing hurt. There were meetings in the depth of night in rooms that had never seen dawn light, and men in them said things as immovable as iron and as false as gold paint. There were fires that took a while to show themselves and then showed all at once. On the morning, the great bells rang like a storm, and no one could be sure if they were sounding grief or triumph. Arya was deep under the Red Keep, listening to water speaking the same language it had spoken the first day the city had risen around this stone. She felt the sound come into her bones. She stood very still. There is a way the earth announces catastrophe. Animals know it, and children who have lived too long in places they should never have had to learn do, too. She ran. The tunnels bucked under her with the kind of motion you get when something above you dies. A wind moved through rock where wind had no business. It smelled of apples turned wrong and lamps gone mad. She had seen a green fire once that had made the river into a throat. She knew what that smell meant. She found a passage she had never used and took it because Lannisters liked thick stone and old Mad Kings had left gifts in the city that men who came after preferred to pretend were myths. She ran with a child's surety that if there was a door, she could fit through it. Behind her the world groaned and then roared. If she had been standing in Maegor's holdfast, she would have seen glass breast after glass breast explode and hurl tits of green fire across the square. If she had been in the sept, she would have been gathered into light as if a new, wrong god had opened its arms and claimed the city once and for all. She was in the walls. The walls held. When the thunder had done the polite thing and moved on to complain to the horizon, she turned back toward the living. The tunnel mouth she chose led to a stair that came up under a stair that came up at last where a door had once had guards and now had none. She pushed and the door swung light as a lie. She stepped out into a world she had not prepared for. Smoke wore the city. It wore it like a cloak, and it wore it like a face, and it wore it like a memory that wouldn't loosen its teeth. Ash moved underfoot like sand at the river's edge. The air tasted sweet and burnt and new all at once. Gray dust lay on the shoulders of a statue of a motherly goddess in pieces. Her head had rolled to a stop in front of a cracked fountain. The great steps of the sept were a line of broken teeth. The bells had stopped. Silence roared. Arya walked forward because if she stopped she would hear her own breathing, and she was not sure she could bear that. A scrap of green fire still lived in a crack, guttering, a thing too stubborn to die and too small to remap the world. She passed it, and her shadow crossed it, and on the stones ahead of her, where 1,000 feet had preached righteousness and powdered marble and tracked in sand and coin and the thief squeaks of mice, she saw footprints. They were small. They were not the prints of soldiers. They crossed the square in a wavering line that told you the maker of them had not known where to go and had gone anyway. She followed. They took her to a bench where dust had begun to settle. The person sitting there was a woman whose hair had lost its pins and whose dress had forgotten its shape. She had eyes like a fjord in winter, deep and cold and full of things that could drown you. She looked at Arya without surprise, which was the same as saying she had always known that every child in the city might one day turn out to be a knife. "You," said Cersei Lannister softly. The word was not a question. She had a goblet in her hand. There was wine in it. There were ashes on the rim. "You've lasted, little wild thing." Arya had her hand on needle. She did not draw it. The world had burned and 1,000 names had become smoke and would never be said again. There were ways to end stories, and there were better ways. Across the square someone groaned. A pigeon hopped into the cindered remnants of someone's hem and pecked. "You did this?" Arya said, and let the words be what they were. Not accusation, but the plain setting down of a stone. Cersei's laugh was raw and old. "If I say yes, am I a witch or a queen?" She lifted the goblet, set it down again. "If I say no, do you open my throat here like a butcher under the moon?" Arya thought of a time long ago when she had watched her father be a good man and die for it. She thought of Sansa, somewhere else at last, perhaps safe, perhaps bound in another kind of gilded iron. She thought of the Hound, the little man, the spider, all the chessmen who had moved and had bled like any peasant when you cut them. She didn't think of gods. She thought of doors. "Not today," she said, but it was not a prayer and not a boast. It was a judgment reserved. Cersei nodded once, as if conceding a point in a debate that would last until the city sank into the river. She got to her feet without grace. She looked around at the square she had killed and claimed and failed and loved. Then she left Arya there and went to bind herself to whatever new story she could make out of the ashes. Arya watched her go. She stood very still so the dust would settle on her shoulders and make her part of the city. Then she put her sword back through her belt and turned toward the tunnels, which were the only true roads she'd left herself. She would go down. She would sleep. She would wake. She would say the names until they were empty. She would fill them again, because names had a way of finding faces to live on no matter how careful you were. She would teach the mice new routes. The city would breathe and sometimes choke and sometimes sing and sometimes scream. She would be there, smaller than the shadow of a pigeon, smaller than the memory of a child's prayer, and as real as the edge of a blade. What if she had left? What if a big, rough hand had caught her elbow in that first wild minute and hauled her into safety that smelled like horse and hay and piss? And what if she'd learned the names of different rivers and different tyrants and a different god? She didn't know that story. She knew this one, with its tunnels and its smoke and the way the light came down from the sky at noon in thin blue swords and cut the dust. The shape of her anger had fit the shape of the city, and both had learned each other like foes who become mirrors. When she slept that night, she dreamed of a hall with 100 doors and none of them locked, and of stepping through one to find the gods' wood at Winterfell, and through another to find the bowels of the Red Keep, and through a third to find a square covered in ash where a pigeon pecked and pecked and pecked. In the morning, she woke into a world that did not care about dreams. She ate, she stood, she went to work, and as she moved through the passages under the Palace of Kings, she felt the whole stone weight of the city above her, and she did not flinch. The smoke clung for days, old and sweet as rot, threading itself through the tapestries and catching in the hair of cooks and pages and women who had not yet learned to see themselves as widows. It seeped through rat runs and kiss holes and the narrow wells where the keep drank. When Arya went down to the cisterns, she found a lace of ash along the water like a veil laid upon a face. She skimmed it away with her palm and watched the gray drift break and rejo. Decide not to dissolve after all, choose to keep being itself. Above, bells clanged and clanged until they were tired of their own voices. People said the queen had cut the faith's throat with a smile. People said none of the dead had screamed because there had been no time. People said the mother and the maiden and the smith had all turned their faces from the city, and the only god left was the one in the queen's heart, and his name was vengeance. People said. Arya listened from the places that had raised her. She listened to a laundress pick ash out of a noblewoman's hair with a comb carved like a wave. She listened to a baker curse the tangle of supply and hunger that would come now that half the men who carried flour had been folded into the smoke. She listened to a boy tell another boy he had seen a green fire eat a man's shadow, and to the other boy say nothing at all. On the third morning, word ran like a knife through the keep. The king had stepped into the air. Arya was in the passage above the old galleries when it reached her. She felt it before she heard it, the way the stone shifted, the way servants forgot the choreography of servitude and collided in doorways, the way men who had thought their oaths were tied with double knots suddenly stood with them frayed in their hands. She found a thin crack in the paneling and pressed her eye to it as if the crack were the only honest thing left. They had set him on a slab on a table high enough to make all the people in the room look a little smaller. His hair was arranged, his feet together, his hands folded around nothing. The queen stood very straight, and for a moment Arya saw her as she must have been at 10. A girl who believed her reflection as a soldier believes his sword. Qyburn hovered behind her like a shadow that had learned how to count. The mountain, Ser Robert Strong to those who preferred lies with their meat, took up a quarter of the room, a slab of knight's promise wrapped in armor. The queen's face did not break. If grief was in her, it was a shape she had locked in a room and thrown the key down a well. Arya watched her touch Tommen's hair and wondered if this woman had ever been a mother on an ordinary morning, with porridge on her fingers and sleep still in her eyes. The thought felt like a trick. She set it down. By afternoon, the city had a new song. It was sung by men in neat rows and by women with voices lined in gold. Long may she reign, the song said, with a pride that meant and may she punish. Qyburn placed the crown and the light slid over his careful hands like approval. Cersei turned and sat on the chair she had burned a city to draw nearer. The hall murmured and bent. The chair did not. Arya watched from an air shaft whose mouth had eaten mice for 100 years. She watched Jaime Lannister enter late, in road mud and disbelief, and stand as if a man had just handed him a map and told him the country he thought he knew was a stranger with knives in both hands. He looked at his sister as if he had been given a new vision, and it hurt. Cersei did not look back at him. She looked over the heads of everyone present as if the hall itself had offended her by not being taller. "Long may she reign," Qyburn said, and the crowd said it back, and Arya, who owned no voice that would be welcome there, barely moved her lips when she said to the dark, "Not long enough." The city adjusted. Cities do. They hide their injuries under new paint and call their limps a gate. The people learned the new drills, where the Queen's Guards set up their posts, which alleys were now knife alleys and which were only hungry. The Faith's ragged soldiers vanished, their stars bent or buried. The Queen's Red kept their boots clean and their belts polished and their eyes open. Qyburn's boys brought him whispers that tasted of soot, and he fed them sugared plums and the idea of safety. He noticed her. He had noticed her long ago, probably in the way a spider feels its web. But now that the city was his laboratory in a way it had not been before, he made the courtesy of turning his eyes toward her shadow one afternoon as she slid along the wall by the old armory. He had a habit of moving quietly without pretending to do so. It was honesty disguised as creep. "You move like one of mine," he said. His tone was mild, the voice of a teacher with a treat in his pocket and a good knife under his gown. "I belong to no one," Arya said. "Aspiring to independence is for those who can afford to eat it." His smile was almost kind. "I could make sure you were never hungry again." "You can't make sure of anything," Arya said. And because she could not help herself, she let him see her teeth in what might have been a smile if they'd been on a different face. "Plenty of the men you fed are ash." "Ah." He regarded the air near her ear, as if conversation were a bird perched there. "Do you ever wake and taste the bloodless space where a new world is about to grow? It is a rare gift. I have it. You do too." He tilted his head. In that moment he gave her the respect of a real appraisal, not the clumsy measuring most men do when they think themselves subtle. "You have killed men. Do you want me to say I'm sorry?" She touched the hilt at her hip because her hand liked to know where it was. "I'm not. Neither am I." His eyes creased in small pleasure. "Come see me one day when you are tired of cutting small pieces from large meat. I have more delicate work. The city will not always require iron. Sometimes it wants a needle." She wanted very much to put her needle into the soft flesh just to the left of his mouth. She did not. The corridor held its breath. He waited for her to say something clever, and because she wouldn't serve him his own mirror, he took his leave with a small bow that would have suited a man who could blush. When rumors of dragons began to move through the city, they came first like jokes. Boys in the market drew them on. Walls, long sausage things with teeth and silly eyes, and old men shook their heads and told each other that all stories were poor when told backward. Then men who had seen sails darkened the taverns and said a queen's fleet moved like weather. Then sailors with eyes that had learned distance spoke of shadows in the clouds at night that hid themselves when you tried to show someone. Then there was a day when all the dogs in the city sang at once and every child under 5 cried until the sound was in the stone. "Ah," the butcher's clerk said to his wife as they watched a troop of men carry a coil of thick rope. "Ah now." Scorpions sprouted like thistles along the walls. Qyburn walked the parapets with drafts and measures in his hands and pointed with fingers that drew straight lines through crowded air. Euron Greyjoy came into the city and out of it again like a storm you can smell but cannot say the shape of. He had eyes that understood pleasure and bored easily at everything that did not resemble it. The queen entertained him with the same look she gave knives. "Show me your sharp and I will consider letting you near my skin." Arya watched the scorpions grow and took to walking their routes. She learned where the winches sat and how the ropes hummed under strain and which bolts were true and which wore the wrong grain. She found the place where a carpenter had been lazy and slipped a sliver of iron into a collar there, so that under heat and pressure it would pretend to be itself until the moment it chose to be a harmless shape with no purpose. She taught 3 mice how to handle oiled cloth and where to tuck it so that wood would forget to be patient. She did not set anything alight. The city had burned enough, but she loosened the idea of certainty as if it were a tooth. The loot train burned out in the reach where Arya could not touch it. and men came back with stories written on their faces in ash that wouldn't wash. They spoke of a sky that had opened to show them their last thought, and it had been green, then gold, then something that had no name. They spoke of a woman on the back of a monster, and the way both woman and monster looked at them as if they were a problem with only one answer. Some laughed when they told it, the laugh of men who must laugh or lie down and never rise. Some had nothing to say at all. The city braced. Qyburn smoothed parchment. Cersei drank wine like it was truth and refused to be drunk. Jaime looked at her and looked at the horizon and then looked at the door and seemed to understand he was a man whose choices had all been spent by someone else. One night he left, and the way the queen broke inside her face when she understood it was a quiet unhinging that made Arya feel a moment's pity she wished she did not feel. Parleys get called when men need to lie in front of witnesses. The word ran through the mice like an itch. Dragon Pit. A place built to hold a thing they had once allowed to live with them in peace until they learned the price. Arya went there via tunnels she had not known the names of until they were needed, and when she came up into the ruin, the morning had chosen a merciful light. They came as if the city had been asked to draw a picture of its own past and future. The little man returned first, to Arya's surprise and not surprise. He walked like a man who had counted his bets and knew precisely how foolish each of them was. Jon Snow came too, a name she had carried like a piece of bread in her pocket when there was no food. Looking like the wall he'd belonged to, hard and simple and true to a fault that the world would not forgive. He stood among dragons and didn't flinch. Seeing him moved something in Arya that had not moved in years, a thaw somewhere deep that frightened and tempted. She stayed in shadow and let that movement pass through her and into the stone. Cersei arrived with her monsters and her smile that had learned how to be cold and hot at once. Qyburn stood at her shoulder with his birds, all pretending not to be there. The Hound came with the Northern Man, and when Arya saw him she felt a strange fierce gladness run under her ribs. Not because he was unhurt, no one is, nor transformed, but because he was exactly the shape of himself, stripped of excuses, honest as a hammer. They told their truths. A box opened and an impossible thing tried to drag itself into the day. Men who'd thought themselves brave learned the limits of that word. The queen listened, made shapes with her mouth, said yes, said no, admitted she would help, and then admitted she had lied about that admission. The little man went to her and did a brave foolish thing in private, because brave foolish things are the only currency some people have. He came back with a face that would not be read. The people filed out into a waiting world that would look exactly the same for a little while and then prove itself changed. Arya sat among long dead bones and touched stone where once a monster had slept, and she thought of Jon. He had stood with the Dragon Queen and her advisor like a table with 3 legs, and she had wanted to walk out and touch his sleeve and put her head on his shoulder and say 1,000 names, all of which were his. She did not. She watched him go. She added a word to her list that was not like the others. Brother. In the weeks after, the city waited the way a hare waits under bracken. The queen, having lied and loved her lie, set about sharpening everything with an edge. Euron sailed out into waters that did not love him. Qyburn whispered to men who kept their hair clean. The mountain stood still and yet seemed to get nearer to wherever you did not want him. Arya made maps of places she had never thought would matter. Narrow servants' arcs from the queen's solar to the secret stairs. Closets within closets where a child could fold herself and become wood. She found a narrow place behind a panel in the hand's chamber where the wall was thin, and the breath of a speaker could come through it like fog if the listener laid her cheek flat against the wood. That was where she was when Tyrion came again, alone, with the Dragon Queen's anger braided in his hair alongside his humor. The room smelled of fruit gone soft. The queen stood by the window and looked out at her city as if she meant to lean on it. Qyburn stood at her elbow with a little vial in his hand. He did not show off but did not hide. The mountain breathed. "You mean to break the wheel," Cersei said. "She means to melt it." "Sometimes those are the same," Tyrion said. He poured wine because if he didn't drink, he did not know what he might taste. "Would you care to tell me how to keep a city safe without throwing it into the sea?" "Keep me safe," she said, and the air thought about becoming a weapon. They argued like 2 people who knew how to love the same child and hated each other for it. They argued like siblings who've traded toys and teeth and now count scars for points. They agreed on nothing. They agreed on one thing in the end, because fear is the only agreement some people can afford. Tyrion left with his mouth hard and his eyes soft, and the knowledge that love would ruin everything if it could. Cersei stayed with her monster and her man of gentle knives and the city she had hired to be her mirror. It was almost a pity, Arya thought later, that the dead chose to be real. Stories are easier to kill, but men in the city spoke of winter things pushing at walls in the north, and even the queen had to pretend to care about that kind of wind. The tales came south bunched in knots of fear. The north had held, the north had cracked. The north had found a king and then a queen and then a reason to keep breathing. The knights of the Reach died in other fields. Winter was not a thing that eyed King's Landing yet. Fire was. At dawn on the day it happened, the air had a taste like a struck nail. Scorpions winked along the walls. Arya ran her routes with the mice and took a last look at the old shafts that coughed onto the outer stairs. She could feel the city holding the breath it had left. When the first sound came, it was a thrum under the feet, then a roar, then a sizzle as air met something that had no business being in it. Drogon came like a word no one knew in their mouth. He did not simply fly, he altered the idea of sky. He dropped like judgment upon the fleet that had arrayed itself like pride on black water. A ship was a torch, was a toothpick, was a name on a tongue that would never speak again. Euron's laughter, which had been a weapon, met a greater one and learned silence. Arya watched from a slit and did not blink. The walls did not hold. Men turned their scorpions and found their hands stung by their own cleverness. Bolts fouled, gears stuck. The careful lines Qyburn had drawn turned traitor under heat and hurry. Drogon danced where steel could not reach him and breathed where stone had thought itself invulnerable. Gates blackened. Standards went from crimson to cinder. The gold cloaks did a thing they had learned from other men. They set their blades down and held their hands up, eyes up, throats open to the idea of mercy. The bells rang then, and in ringing they told the city what it had become. Not a capital, not a crown, but a mouth asking to be spared. For a heartbeat, too, Arya thought the sound would be heard by the right ears in the right way. She felt a softening somewhere above the pitch and burn, a swing toward the good. Then the dragon's head turned, and the queen on its back made a choice, and the world remade itself in fire. Fire falls. It does not discriminate. It does not remember your plots, your careful map of scorpions, your name, your list, your brother. It falls and turns alley to oven, square to kiln, air to breathless argument. It licks the backs of running women and slides up under skirts men had lifted to run and sets everything to the same bright pitch. Arya ran into it anyway because she had memorized this city's secret places and had learned which stones dreamed of water. She shouted to mice and they scattered, carrying the routes she taught them like string in their hands to lead others through the maze. In the lower streets, a woman in a gray dress held a child whose thin arm had a bracelet made of string. The string had a red bead on it. Arya saw the bead as she had seen 1,000 details and knew that bead would hold her across a dream some night when she wanted to sleep and could not. The woman stumbled. Fire chose the next street for its playful violence. Arya took the woman's elbow in a grip that brooked no argument and hauled her into a narrow cut between two houses where the mortar sweated. "This way," she said, and the woman believed. "People do when you sound like you know." She led 10 out through a seam she had widened when she had nothing else to do but widen seams. She lost 6 to smoke, 3 to crush, 1 to the sudden strong arm of a soldier who wanted something for himself before he died. She put steel in that soldier and left a piece of herself behind his ribs and kept moving. The bead flashed. She lost track of it. She found it again. She lost it. She reached the square that had held the goddess with her head off and found it full of the past. Men burned in the open. A horse screamed with a voice that was almost human and then ceased to be. The queen watched with eyes that had learned a new meaning for the word necessary, and the dragon carved loops through the city like a child drawing on a page with a coal. Arya went toward the keep because she had always gone toward the place where the knife might be and because there was one name left that still tasted like iron on her tongue. The keep had learned fear. It showed it by coughs and cracks and in the way the stair under Arya's feet shifted like a lazy beast that would roll if she let it. She took the turns that had never been meant for ladies and sometimes had been meant for murderers. When she came out into the hall before the Queen's solar, she found Blood making a patient line along the base of the wall and Qyburn standing in it, ankle deep, as if it were a new kind of bath. He looked at her with tired amusement. "It is an ugly day to be right," he said. "It's a good day for a rat to go missing," she said. The mountain stood behind him, inhuman in his readiness. Through a broken arch she could see a slice of sky and a shape moving across it that was not a bird. "Would you like to trade, little needle?" Qyburn asked. "Your trade for mine." "Your trade is rot," she said. "Mine's simple." He moved his fingers and the mountain moved. He moved like a collapsing wall, a body of blunt facts. Arya went sideways under a swing that would have cut a smaller girl in two. She felt the wind of it on her neck, hot and fouled. She put needle into the joint behind his knee where flesh might still remember its original purpose. The blade went in a finger's width and then met something that felt like a fist clenching around it. She wrenched. The mountain turned with a grace that only bulk can have. He reached for her head as if it were a cup he meant to lift. She danced back and would have been pinned between his reaching and the wall if the hound hadn't chosen exactly that moment to come up the other stair. "Little rat," he growled through cracked breath and old hate. "You find the worst rooms." "I live here," she said, and so did the joy that came with him like a shadow remembering how to be itself. He did not look at her again. He looked at his brother, and all the years of what had been done to him rose up around him like heat. Qyburn lifted a hand to insert himself back into a narrative he had enjoyed writing. Just here, just now, the mountain would turn and do what he had been made to do. And the mountain, eager to obey the true gravity in the room, backhanded his maker with a casual violence that took the man like a piece from a shelf and set him down against a stair with the sound of a dropped vase. Qyburn slid down 2 steps like a thought that had failed to become a sentence and stopped. He did not move again. "Go," the hound told Arya without looking away from the only thing that had ever truly had his attention. "This is mine." She wanted very much to refuse him. She wanted to say, "I have a list and a right and a place in this." She looked at him and saw the stubborn boy whose face had been changed by someone else's fire and who had learned to wear his scar like a country and not a wound. She touched his arm because it was the only blessing she had. "Don't lose," she said. "Never did," he said, which was as close as either of them would come to acknowledging the truth of losing. Then he went at the mountain like a man going into his own grave and determined to make it a wider one. She ran toward the Queen. The keep had ideas about falling now and executed them with enthusiasm. Paving heaved. Arches learned that gravity is not a suggestion. She found Cersei on a causeway that had been a gallery and would soon be a memory, moving stubbornly toward a way out that had already died. They saw each other in a pocket of stillness amid the city's scream. Cersei had lost her jeweled hair. What remained lay heavy and dull against her neck. Blood had dried on her chin and then been washed and then dried again. Her eyes found Arya and did not widen. They were past surprise. They were 2 women who had each chosen their rooms in this house and kept choosing. "You," Cersei said. The word was never a question. "You burned the September," Arya said. "You broke the bells." "The world breaks," Cersei said. "I simply chose when to watch." "You could have chosen to stop," Arya said. "And you could have chosen to leave," Cersei said. "What do you want, child? Justice? There is none. Mercy? Neither of us has that to spare. There are moments when the body knows what the mind is not yet willing to write." Arya's hand moved of its own memory. Needle came up, bright even in smoke. Cersei's mouth shaped contempt, and behind it something that might have been prayer and might have been habit pretending to be prayer. "Not today," Arya had told her in the ash of another day. She was not that girl now, and this was not that day. But as she weighed the needle in her hand, a piece of stone fell somewhere above them with a roar that decided the question by reminding her that there were other lives depending on the next choice. Behind Cersei, men and women fled along a narrowing funnel of hallway toward a promise of safe stairs and air. If Arya made one death there, 10 others might die for the delay. Tomorrow, then, Cersei whispered with a jagged little smile, as if daring her. Arya did not commit to her enemy's schedule. She tilted the blade until it kissed Cersei's throat without breaking skin. Cersei didn't flinch. Between them, a wind blew a ribbon of ash and made it into a living snake that uncoiled and fell apart. She lowered the blade and stepped aside, and in that small act she felt both betrayal and fidelity gather and shake hands. Cersei went on. Arya breathed and turned back toward the cries that had become her own. She found the hound later in a stair that had opened like a throat. The mountain lay across it like a collapsed altar, the head dented where an iron ball had kissed it, the body finally remembering the courtesy due to weight. The hound lay under a new fall of stone, half buried, one hand free. The free hand clenched and unclenched, seeking purpose. "I told you not to lose," she said. He made a sound that might have been seen as a laugh by a generous translator. "Never did," he said again. "Tell your list I kept my vow." She took his free hand. It was hot and some of the heat was his. She did not have anything to say to death. They had made their peace when she was 9. "The fire's done," she said, "although the air still be you." "Ned, never done," he said, and closed his eyes because sometimes truth wants to be told into darkness. She stayed with him a short time, long enough to keep him company and to make sure he was not utterly alone in the last honest thing he did. Then she took what was left of herself and made it into movement because that was how you stayed alive. A small, constant translation from one breath to the next. When the dragon had finished, the city sounded like a field after harvest. Empty wind, distant crows, the particular silence that follows a decision. Men in gray came through the smoke with the faces of people who were ready to make lists. The queen walked the red and breathed with difficulty and did not quite cry. Jaime found her and added his uncertainty to hers. They fell together under stone and story like lovers who have learned too late how similar those two things can be. Arya led 100 people through a stink that replaced religion. She carried a girl half the way whose bead had broken from its string and now lay in the girl's mouth as if it were a sweet she meant to save for later. The girl died in her arms when the smoke found her lungs and made a home. Arya set her down by a door with a bright brass knocker shaped like a fish that had probably once made a cook laugh, and she put the bead in the girl's hand and closed the fingers over it and said not today to no one at all. When the ash stopped falling like stubborn snow, the city found new rules. Grey Worm, whose name had learned how to be granite without losing its pulse, came through the streets with men who had never thought themselves conquerors and now found that someone had made them that shape. They killed where killing would make a point. They took where taking would teach. Tyrion went to the ruins of the throne and wept because men do that when their cleverness fails to save what needed saving. Jon walked with his jaw clenched until his teeth ached and his eyes had that far look that means a man is holding himself very, very still. Arya watched Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name on that continent, climb a blackened stair into a wind that loved her cloak and a rhetoric that loved itself. The dragon crouched behind her, the breath of it ghosting in the air. The speech rolled out like a red carpet for ideas that would burn whatever walked on them. Jon stood below, not yet a decision but a path that had learned its ending. She could have killed the queen then. She could have found a place where a knife would find its way through her ribs. But every route she drew ended in the same room. More fire, more consequence for those with no names anyone important would speak. She stayed her hand, which was not the same as shaking. She held her list in her throat like a swallow she would not make. Tyrion threw his brooch away. Men who had once called him Lord and laughed at his jokes took him by the arm and thought about how to break his fingers in a way that would teach him respect. Arya followed them through a puzzle of corridors that had survived and stood outside a door and listened to a conversation between him and Jon that sounded like two men laying cards they hated on a table they didn't want to sit at. She heard Tyrion say love is the death of duty, then reverse it with that quick mind of his, duty is the death of love, and she thought, no, it is just the shape love takes when someone else holds the knife. She did not follow Jon to the throne room. She would never know how the light fell on the melted sword shapes of the chair that had invited and killed so many, or the exact look on Daenerys' face when she looked at that thing and saw not metal but a story. She heard the sound, the soft small gasp that is exactly the same regardless of who makes it, when Jon's knife went in. She heard the dragon's cry, which was like the world tearing a page from itself. She watched from a high slit and saw the dragon take its grief out not on the man but on the symbol, and she felt a bleak admiration for a beast that could understand what men pretend to. She watched it carry the queen away. She watched the city sag in relief that had nowhere to go. Then came the counting. The wrong men called themselves right, and the right men kept their tongues alive by tying them to patience. The council gathered in a place where grass had once grown and might again if given time. Men whose names had been prayers sat on rough benches and said things about destiny because it is easier than saying, "We did not know what we were doing and now we must make a smaller, more careful world." Bran the Broken became king. The title went around the world like a rumor that decided to be real. Sansa took the north and made it into a place that would not bend, and the thought of her standing in snow with wolves at her back braided hurt and pride through Arya's chest. Jon went away a last time, to the old wall of his life, to walk in snow that would sting and welcome him in the same breath. Tyrion took up service again because some men are tools built for only one shape of work, and they know it and accept it and are noble in that acceptance even if they hate it. No one called Arya to that council. No one had the right. She listened from the grass's point of view as men argued nuance and women addressed like queens learned to take up space. She watched a city decide to be a body again after being a wound. Deciding what to do with a ghost is a problem cities rarely solve. She had been the ghost in King's Landing for as long as she had been anyone. She had walked the veins and arteries, she had carried whispers and knives. Now the body had a new head and a new temper. Should she stay? It was the question she had never asked because asking it risked the answer. She stayed at first because there was work. Grey Worm, his dragon queen gone and his compass spinning, kept order with a hard hand while the boats were built to take him and his men to a place ere they could rebuild their own idea of what a life meant. Before he went, he sanctioned a dozen deaths that Tyrion could not stop and Jon could not condemn out loud. Arya watched and intervened twice, turning a public killing into a private beating with a well-placed blow. She taught herself the difference between justice and relief and did not like how thin the line felt under her feet. Qyburn's apprentices scattered like rats who have seen the cat's bones. Arya and the mice hunted two of them, boys whose eyes had learned hunger as discipline. One she let go after she made him empty his little belt pouch of all the small horrors it contained. One she chased down to a cellar and found him clutching a jar with something in it that might once have been a man's finger. He told her, sobbing, that he had not wanted to learn this trade, that he had been good at numbers. She took the jar and set it on the floor and broke it and left him there in the smell of all the dead ideas he had served. And maybe that was kinder than a knife because later she saw him on the steps of the Motherless Sept sweeping ash with a broom that had belonged to someone who had believed in clean floors. The mountain lay where he lay. Men moved the stones off him with care and fear mixed in equal measure, then burned what they found and salted the ashes because superstition is the only science the poor can afford. They buried Qyburn in a wall that would later be whitewashed. Someone drew a star above the place with soot. A week later the star had faded. Arya alone remembered where the mortar was uneven. One night, when the breeze off the river brought a smell that was almost not death, Arya climbed to the top of a tower that had learned its lesson about standing tall. She sat with her back to a crenel and looked out over the city that had chosen to be her house. Somewhere out there, in the direction of the dragon pit, grass had begun to pry apart the ash. Somewhere a hen had found a roost and a child had laughed at its silly scratching. Somewhere, she told herself, a woman had taken a bead from her pocket, its red glass catching a sliver of warm light, and threaded it onto a new string, and tied the string around a thin wrist and said, "Hold on." She could go north. The thought came as it had come before, a door in her dream hall opening and showing a godswood whose leaves had never forgotten the right red. Sansa would take her into a room and shut the door on the world and put bread in her lap and pour wine into her cup that didn't taste of old wood. Jon would fold her into a hug that left the smell of snow in her hair. She heard her mother's voice, which was not helpful because it was all pity and she had used pity up. Or she could go west, as a woman she did not know in a story she wasn't telling had once dreamed of doing. There were maps she had not seen, seas that had never burned, cities with names that tasted different. There were knives there, too. She had enough names left to carry for 3 lifetimes if she wanted them. Where she could stay. She stayed. She told herself she would leave when the city didn't need her. Even as she knew cities can always use a ghost. She became, slowly, a whisper that chose its days. She sat on stairwells and eavesdropped during new argues about grain allotments and tax roads and water rights. And once, when a lord who had survived all the burning decided to keep his winter store for people with more rings on their fingers, she removed 3 bolts from the hinges of his storehouse at dusk and returned at midnight with 5 mice and took exactly enough sacks that when they were found missing he would be embarrassed but not ruined. She found where the new hand kept notes and moved 2 sentences on 2 different pieces of parchment on 2 different nights. Enough to slow a decision until a man who had no boots could get them. Sometimes she took a life. Killers do not retire with grace. There was a small cluster of men in the shadow of the Dragon Gate who had decided that rape would be their tax. She met them one by one. She did not teach them lessons. She ended their sentences. There was a guard who had learned to be bought when that had been the cost of breathing and now would not unlearn it. She marked him with a cut that told him he was seen and left him alive because some men are more useful to a city as a warning than as meat. There was a woman who hurt children in the name of a god she had invented to make herself feel less dirty. Arya put her in a doorway and broke her ability to make a fist and left her to a kindness that would be given by another woman with a broom and a sense of what is due. Tyrion became good at being the man who put the right number of coins on the right scale. He drank less and made better jokes. He saw her once, truly saw her, in a corridor that ran like a vein beneath the audience hall. He looked at her long enough to count, and then he looked away again, the elegance of not forcing recognition a gift she admired him for. She had liked him as a child because he was the only adult who spoke to her as if her head contained more than hair. As a ghost she liked him because he refused to pretend about cruelty and still tried, in his small, careful way, to do less of it. Bran the King came once, quietly, with a guard of men chosen for their ability to keep their mouths closed. He sat in the hall on the chair that had been borrowed from another room because the old one had melted into memory. He said little. He watched people talk around him and he listened. Arya watched him from above and tilted her head and tried to find the boy. There he was, somewhere deep, an axle within an axle. When he left, the city breathed a little easier because the burden of being watched by someone who was not quite in the same room is a kind of weight. She had thought to hate him for taking Winterfell from her list of places to dream of. She did not. He watched the city as a man watches a bird he has promised not to cage. The seasons turned. King's Landing found a new face that was not handsome in the old way but was proud in the way of a scar you've decided is part of your smile. The rivermen brought fresh fish again, and the girls at the fountain learned to laugh earlier in the day. The poor remained because cities make them the way beehives make honey, but they had less reason to be afraid at midday. Arya turned a boy toward the carpenter who needed an apprentice and away from the gambler who needed a runner. She delivered a message to a woman whose husband had not come home. The message was that he had died quickly, and as she held the woman's hand while she grieved something out of herself, Arya thought of a slow death she would have prevented and felt clean. Now and again, a name rose, a weed pushing up between paving stones with unwelcome vigor. Ser Mandon Moore would never know he had missed her. Island Payne had lost his tongue and then lost the habit of having his name said in rooms with light. Cersei was gone, buried under the story of her city, and when they dug many months later and found bone, they could not agree on whose bone it was, and Arya smiled because some arguments are worth leaving. There were new names. There would always be new names. One morning a girl in a plain dress came to the place beneath the stairs where Arya sometimes sat to feel the cool. She was maybe 12, with that stubborn set to her jaw that told Arya she would either break the world a little or the world would break her and there would be no third choice. "I've been told you're a liar," the girl said without preamble. "They were wise," Arya said. "Also they told me you can show me where it's safest when men get loud in the street." Arya considered her. "That's a different price." "I don't have coin," the girl said. She planted her feet. "I have eyes." Arya smiled with only half her mouth. "Keep them. You'll need them." She stood. "Come. If you run, run as if your knees had been promised to someone else." She taught the girl 3 routes. She taught her where to put her shoulder if a door refused her. She taught her to go toward stone when wood turned murderous. She taught her to trust women with clean aprons and men whose hands were busy. She taught her to stand a certain way with her chin lifted that said, "If you touch me, you will bleed." She gave her a sliver of oiled cloth and told her to keep it by, and when the girl asked what it was for, Arya said, "Something you will not understand until you need to." When they parted, the girl turned and said, as if it were an afterthought, "Are you a lady?" Arya laughed then, a sound that surprised the stone. "Sometimes," she said, "when I have clean knees." She went on. She kept to her rules. She broke some. She sat in a tavern once and listened to a singer who had fashioned a song about a girl in a city who never left it. It was an ugly song with a gorgeous refrain. "She is the echo in the stone," it went, "she is the whispering." She put a coin in the singer's cup when he came by and saw him blink because the coin was too heavy for such a small courtesy. She left before he could thank her because she did not like being looked at like that. She dreamed sometimes of doors. She dreamed of the one she had chosen at 10, down, not out, and how it had never truly closed behind her. She dreamed of a ship that never left its mooring and a horizon that came to it out of politeness. She dreamed of a square covered in ash and a pigeon pecking and pecking and pecking. In the morning she woke and stretched and checked Needle's Edge and went into the city and did exactly as much as one ghost can do. Once, at dusk, in the godswood that had grown small and stubborn again from a root that had not burned, she felt someone step up beside her. She did not reach for her sword. The step was known to her body before her ear caught it. "Sansa," she said, and then she did turn. "Because you cannot keep from your face the things it wants when you love." Sansa had come south under banners and protection and the kind of cold that carries its own weather around it. She looked like Winterfell made into a woman. She looked like a crown that had stopped cutting her forehead and started teaching it where to rest. They put their foreheads together like dogs and breathed each other. And in that breath all the doors in Arya's dream hall opened and did not frighten her. "You stayed," Sansa said, and in her voice there was no judgment, only an accounting. "I did," Arya said. "Do you want to come home?" Arya thought about it with the seriousness she gave to a door that had never been tried. "This is a home," she said at last. "Not the only." "Enough." Sansa nodded. "I brought you cheese that went wrong on the road," she said. "I know you like things that bite back." They ate under a tree that had learned to be shy in this climate. Sansa told her things about the north that smelled of clean cold. Arya told her things about the city that smelled of warmed stone and smoke gone to memory. They did not say the names of the dead as if counting them gave anything back. They did not say the names of the living as if that would keep them from being added to the first list. They sat, and when the light went wrong and the evening turned petty, Sansa stood and put her hand on Arya's shoulder and said, "I am proud," and left, because queens do not get to linger in their own stories. Arya sat a while longer and then went down to the tunnels because someone had to show the mice where the earth had shifted last month and which door stuck now at the top of the second stair. She ran a hand along familiar damp. The stone breathed. She breathed back. Above, the city tried another of its faces on and decided to keep it for a season. There were doors she had not opened and might never. There were names she had said until they lost their meat and became chalk. In her mouth, there were children who would grow up into a world where the bells rang for weddings and for markets and for storms, and if you told them there had been a day when the bells had rung for mercy that did not come, they would look at you with wise eyes that had not yet learned how to cry for strangers, and then, later, they would. She went home, which was no place, and every place she had decided to stop for bread and water and 1 hour's sleeping. Needle lay in her hand a while before it fell to her side. There was no one to say good night to except the one who had learned to hold her tongue and sleep when she could. She closed her eyes. She dreamed of a hall with 100 doors. She did not open any of them. The stone was enough. The whispering was the only song she needed. The next morning there would be money to be returned quietly because it had been extorted. There would be a man to be convinced he did not want to beat his wife anymore. There would be a boy to be taught to count without stealing. There would be a woman to be given the name of a midwife who didn't pretend at gods. It was not the work of queens. It was the work that kept a city from becoming only a place where crowns and dragons argued. She rose before dawn. The air in the tunnels was like a hand she had learned to shake. She set her feet where they knew to go. The city listened for her, as it always had, as it always would now that it had discovered it could. She was not large. She was not loud. She was not the kind of legend you can carve into a shield. She was what the stone knows, and the stone had a long memory. As she walked, she said the names out of habit, the way you say a prayer you no longer believe in because the sound is a comfort. Circe, Island Pain, The Mountain, Marin Trant, Joffrey, Walder Frey, and that made her smile because she had seen to him before she ever learned how to stay. The list was a string of beads. She had broken some, kept some, threaded others newly. When she reached the end, she said her own name very softly, not out of vanity but to remind herself that she was among the living and that this, too, was a kind of duty, Arya. Then she said the name of the city, and the city said it back, not in words but in the settling of dust and the lift of a latch and the faint cool of water somewhere ahead. She went toward it. She always would until she was done, and when she was done the city would still be standing, tilted, scarred, old as a hand on a child's head, and someone else would learn the routes, and someone else would say the names and mean them, and she would become what she had always already been in the stories other people told. The proof that some small, sharp things survive not because the world loves them, but because they teach the world how to hold itself without drawing blood.